And Ben was disciplined many times. He would talk to my mother. He loved my mother, not sexually, but nowadays if you say love, everybody thinks immediately that way. But they had a closeness to them, you know, and he would never tell her what went on, because he was a very old-fashioned man, Ben, and certain things you never spoke to a lady about. You got to remember their generation. He would never go into it. The only thing he'd say about Judge Landis is he snarled. He says a cracker, and he never used profanity. So the worst thing he could say is he's a cracker, you know, and that was all he would say about Landis. And the poor man was persecuted. He was later, by the way, pardoned completely by Roosevelt in 1932 for unjust imprisonment. And a lot of the Wobblies were pardoned long after. They suffered egregiously in prison. Some of them died in prison. Some of them went mad. So we had a friend. Maybe I could read you this part of it, and then I'll get off the Wobblies, because he did other things. I know you might be bored. I'm talking too long already. That's my problem. I can never organize the thing to what, you know. But I just mentioned Ben here. Yeah. There's a beautiful quote. I'll just give it quickly. There's this lady, Matilda Robbins, who was a prominent Wobbly organizer at the time. And on one of my organizing assignments, which took me from the textile towns of the South, and by the way, this is an understatement, here's a woman in 1912 organizing in the textile towns of the South. Let that sink in a little bit, right? A lot of them are very, very, very courageous. There wasn't only Wobbly men. Towns of the South to those of the North, I stopped in Philadelphia where Ben was organizing longshoremen. I met him for the first time when I heard him speak one night at the IWW hall. I remember how strongly he held the attention of the grim-faced, work-marked men, how their faces brightened with understanding of the need for solidarity and resistance against the shipping companies who kept them divided. Ben won the confidence of both Negro and white workers by his exposition of how they were being used against one another. Day after day and night after night, he covered the waterfront, 20 miles of it, repeatedly at the risk of his life. He took me to the slums of the city of brotherly love, where longshoremen and their families lived. He agonized over their degrading poverty. He was of them, he was with them. So I go on describing things. Then I say class warfare on the Philadelphia docks left no place for the faint of heart. You can imagine, right? I am in a position to affix the footnote concerning the tactics of the Wobblies. My parents were friends not only of Ben Fletcher, but of several of Ben's comrades, among them Manuel Ray, and especially Irish-American organizer John, quotes, Jack Walsh. Jack devoted 15 years of his life to Local 8 and to the ideals it embodied. He also did 10 years in Leavenworth. But they commuted the sentences in the early 20s because It was a political liability to keep them in prison. The mood of the country changed more toward the liberal end. The war was over. Live and let live. They felt that they clipped the Wobblies' wings. There was no point in leaving them in jail, so they let them out. Actually, Harding wanted to let them out if they would appeal individually for pardons, and there were of the 100 of them, over 50 signed a petition, said we were convicted en masse unjustly, so we should be pardoned en masse rather than individually. They stayed in jail instead. Which, think about that. I mean, I personally am a coward. So I'm just telling you how they were. So anyway, Jack had devoted 15 years of his life to Local 8 and to the ideals it embodied. He was a taciturn, solitary man, and so Mother considered it a coup when he agreed to address the IWW forum my parents conducted alternate Sunday afternoons at the Labor Temple. And that was a place, Presbyterian church, they let us use a room there. I don't want to get into the details, but I want to talk about this. I remember Jack Walsh vividly, a thin man, sharp-featured, white hair impeccably combed. He wore neatly pressed jeans and a tweed jacket over an open blue work shirt. Today this is the standard uniform of the university professor, but in those times jeans and jacket were an anachronism, a statement of eccentricity, or in Jack's case, poverty. He lived in a Bowery. He came across as a man of intelligence with the pointed, biting turn of phrase typical of many Wobblies, and he proceeded to give a lecture on the history of the Philadelphia waterfront, worthy of the best university professor. The usual 11 people were present, three of whom were certifiable, and one from the cold. The rest witnessed a bygone era come to life. Jack described in detail in that sparse, tiny room the full spectrum of power the ship owners and stevedoring firms employed to crush the Revolutionary Union. Goons to intimidate the men, police and courts to beat and jail organizers, and strikers, scab labor to break strikes and usurp jobs, the press to lie about the men and impugn their motivations. The motivations of the Wobblies. And to this list, this is what I want to read, add the special services of the Mafia. The Wobblies answered back, and though I remember no specifics from 60-odd years ago, this I do recall. The Mafia, at the behest of the ship owners, carried out a systematic campaign of terror against Wobbly organizers and the longshoremen they tried to reach on the docks. They would break up the crowds around Wobbly soapboxes by clubbing listeners, and were especially vicious toward those who took Wobbly leaflets. Some of the speakers they beat to near death. But to use a contemporary phrase alien to the Jack Walsh vocabulary, this time the Mafia fucked with the wrong bunch. I do that as a writer. I don't, maybe it sounds vulgar. I try to mix up the language so that it doesn't, you're not always reading on the same level. So I'll put in something like that. But anyway, as Jack described it, the Wobblies were cool and measured in their response. They observed carefully the Mafia chain of command, who the errand boys were, to whom they reported, and so on up. It took a while. Then, when they were ready, they pounced, grabbed a Mafia boss, not a low-level guy, and dragged him to the Wobbly Hall, where they proceeded to, in silence, to beat him to a pulp. This is the Mafia. The moment before tossing him out onto the gutter, they gave him an instruction. Tell this to your friends. For every one of us, two of you. Jack called it the work of the, quotes, education committee. So, you know. And then I say, it is a colorful story, but I hesitate telling it because it seems to reinforce the stereotype that Union people, and the Wobblies in particular, were a violent bunch. An impression that is to me laughable in view of the violence, state-sponsored and otherwise, that they were up against. But, I don't want to go into, but so I sort of apologize for what I wrote, but I thought it was a colorful anecdote, and it gave you the flavor of these guys. They were not Boy Scouts. They were tough men. They really were. So I go into the whole thing about how he's at trial, Ben, and he's sent to prison. I say I knew them all. I knew them. But here is one part that at the end that I wished I could tell you about. Two things. I'll never forget my last image of Ben. Sam, and I always called my father. See, my father didn't like to be called father. He thought it was too authoritarian. And he loved people who talked back to him. He loved my daughter, because he adored my daughter. So he pictured her, she's a little girl, he's 5 years old, he'd pitch her cheek, he'd do all the things that you're not supposed to do. He'd follow her around, he'd make faces. And he was a bigger child than she was. So finally she'd get upset, and she'd say, "Grandpa, leave me alone," So my wife, my ex-wife, she said, "Don't speak to your grandfather like that," And he's delighted. He smiles, says, "I love a fresh kid. Here," he puts his hand in his pocket and gives her a quarter. Just the opposite. He liked him as a rebellious child. I like a rebellious child, he said. And that was his personality. So I'll not forget my last image of Ben. Sam took me to see him one Saturday afternoon, 1948 or so. He would die less than a year later in 1949. He was not at all well. He was not well at all, and looking back, I am sure it was the reason for our visit. Clara, that was his wife, and Ben lived in the basement of their brownstone. The windows were high at street level, and the rooms were dark. Sam and Ben had a good time laughing and gossiping about the old days. Sarah went off to work. See, by this time he was a sick man, he didn't do much. Clara went off to work. Ben flipped on the TV set, one of those antediluvian Dumonts, I don't know if you ever know what they are, with the round 10-inch screen. This was 1948. We had no TV, so I stared in awe at this marvel of technological progress. Ben had on the ball game. You have to know a little about baseball. It was the Brooklyn Dodgers. Ben watched the tiny black and white action intently. Suddenly the tension was broken. With the poor camera work of the day, you could barely see the flickering image of a player no larger than an ant scooting around the bases. Ben thumped his hands up and down in joy. He turned to me, his eyes bright in the dark room as Sam and I prepared to leave. "He got a hit, he got a hit, you see that, he got a hit." It was Jackie Robinson. You know who he was? So I felt this was, I remember this my whole life. Here I am, I was a little boy, but to me it was so poignant. I didn't know as a boy about the poignancy part. I remembered the incident, but later I realized this man who done so much, forgotten, living in the basement of a Brooklyn slum, and here's the other man,